I had always loved hiking, but this trip was different. There was something about the quiet, the isolation, that felt off. I didn't think much of it at first. It was a weekend getaway. The weather was perfect, the sky was clear, and the trees around me were lush and full, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. I had planned this solo hike for weeks, wanting to disconnect from the usual noise and stress of daily life. I had everything I needed: snacks, water, a map, and a fully charged phone. It was supposed to be a peaceful time alone in nature. But as I began to walk deeper into the woods, I felt something in my gut shift. It started small, a feeling that I couldn't shake, like someone was watching me. But every time I turned around, there was nothing but trees. I shook it off. I had hiked these trails before, knew them well. The path was familiar, nothing had changed. But that creeping sense of unease grew. My footsteps sounded louder than usual, and the air felt colder, even though the sun was still high in the sky. The trail wound up a hill, and I decided to keep going. The higher I climbed, the quieter everything became. The usual sounds of birds and squirrels faded into silence. I thought it was odd, but attributed it to the altitude. Maybe the wind was blocking the sounds, or maybe I was just too focused on putting one foot in front of the other. About 2 hours into my hike, I noticed something strange. There were no more footprints. Normally, a popular trail like this would have some signs of other hikers, even if it wasn't crowded. But the path was empty. Not a single other person had passed. That should have been comforting in a way, but it made me feel even more isolated. I stopped and scanned the area. The woods around me were thick and dense, a mixture of tall pines and oaks that created dark patches on the ground, where the sun barely touched. The shadows felt oppressive, like they were closing in. I paused for a drink and pulled out my map. I wasn't lost, not exactly, but the area was starting to look unfamiliar. The trail markers weren't as clear as they had been at the beginning, and the landscape was starting to change in subtle ways. The trees were thicker now, and the underbrush more tangled. There were no more markers or signs indicating how much further to go, just a winding trail that seemed to stretch on endlessly. As I continued, the unease gnawed at me. I felt like I was being pulled into the depths of the woods, far from civilization. My phone had no signal, and the thought that I might not be able to reach anyone if something went wrong began to creep into my mind. But I pushed the thought away. I had dealt with worse before. A little discomfort wasn't going to stop me. I wanted to see what was at the top of this trail, the view, the feeling of accomplishment. The path began to steepen, and the trees grew even denser. The sunlight was almost entirely blocked now. I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck, and the weight of my pack seemed to grow heavier with every step. My breath came a little faster, but I pushed myself onward, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Then I heard it, a rustling noise in the bushes. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, staring ahead, my breath catching in my throat. I was sure I wasn't alone. It wasn't an animal. The rustling was too deliberate, too controlled. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sound, but everything was still, too still. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind. A small animal, maybe. I started walking again, slowly, deliberately, but every few steps, I felt the same prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like eyes were on me, tracking my every move. I looked over my shoulder once more, but saw nothing, just the forest, dense and dark, stretching in every direction. The trail ahead seemed to disappear into the trees, becoming more of a faint footpath than a clear trail. It was as though I was heading deeper into the heart of the forest, and the more I walked, the more I realized I hadn't seen any other hikers for hours. No one had passed me. There were no sounds, no signs of life. It was as if the woods had swallowed everything. As I reached the top of the hill, I found a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a few flat rocks and a view of more trees in the distance. There was no grand vista like I had hoped, just more wilderness stretching out ahead. I dropped my pack and sat down on one of the rocks, pulling out my water bottle and taking a long drink. My hands were shaking now, and it wasn't just from the exertion of the hike. I took a moment to breathe and calm myself, telling myself that it was just my imagination. I had been alone for too long, I was tired, and I was overthinking things. I took in the quiet around me, tried to enjoy the solitude. But something was wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but everything felt off. The silence was unnatural, like the world itself had stopped moving. There was no wind, no birds, no sounds of animals, just the echo of my own thoughts in the stillness. I checked my phone again, but still no signal. It was strange. The trail wasn't that far out, and I should have had service by now. I made a mental note to turn back soon, but the thought of retracing my steps through the dense woods didn't appeal to me. I knew the way, but everything felt different now. I looked at the path I had come from, and it seemed more intimidating than before, as if the woods were pushing me away. As I sat there trying to center myself, I heard it again, a faint rustling, far off in the distance. This time it was followed by a crunch, like something heavy stepping on dry leaves. I stood up abruptly, scanning the forest around me. I saw nothing, no movement. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. I wasn't sure what it was, but I wasn't alone anymore. I grabbed my pack and started down the path, not wanting to stay in the clearing any longer. I walked quickly at first, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. The trail seemed longer now, more twisted, and my pace slowed as I tried to navigate the overgrown path. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking, but the shadows were growing longer, and the sky was starting to darken. Suddenly, I heard the sound again. It was closer this time, unmistakable, the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. I stopped dead in my tracks. Someone was following me. I wasn't sure how far back they were, but I could hear the footsteps, slow, deliberate, just like the rustling I had heard earlier. I didn't look back, couldn't. My legs were moving now, almost on their own, carrying me faster down the trail. The trees closed in on me, the path narrowing. My breath was coming in sharp gasps, and I felt a tightness in my chest. I tried to keep my footing, but the uneven ground made it difficult. I could still hear the footsteps behind me, not far, but just close enough to make me panic. I broke into a run. Branches whipped at my face, and the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. The weight of my pack felt like it was dragging me down, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away. The air was thick now, and my vision blurred with the effort of running through the dense forest. My heart was pounding in my ears, and my mind was racing. The trail seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember. There was no clear path anymore, just a tangle of roots and branches. I stumbled, falling hard to the ground, but I didn't stop. I scrambled back to my feet, ignoring the pain in my knees and hands. I had to keep moving. Finally, I saw it. A break in the trees, a clearing that led to the parking area where I had started my hike. I pushed myself harder, running toward it, and burst out into the open, gasping for air. My heart was still racing, but I was out. I had made it. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was safely in my car, the engine running, the doors locked. The silence inside the vehicle felt deafening, but it was comforting. The sense of being watched was gone. The footsteps, the rustling, everything had stopped. I didn't need to know what it was. I didn't need to understand why I had felt that way. All I knew was that I was safe, and that was enough. As I drove away, I took one last glance at the woods, the place I had just come from. It looked peaceful from a distance, but I knew better now. There were things out there that weren't always visible. Sometimes the woods have a way of hiding their secrets, and sometimes it's better not to know them. I've always been a fan of hiking, of getting lost in nature. The sound of leaves crunching beneath my boots, the wind rustling through the trees, the feeling of being so far away from the noise of the city. It's something I crave. So, when I heard about a trail that wasn't too far from my town, I figured I'd check it out. It wasn't well known, mostly just locals that had heard of it, which made it even more appealing. No tourists, no crowds, just me and the woods. The trailhead was tucked away, hidden behind a narrow dirt road that wound its way through a thick stretch of forest. I parked my car at the end of the road, where the trail began. The trees were towering above me, their branches like fingers stretching toward the sky. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, damp from a recent rain. The air smelled fresh, earthy, and alive, full of that wet forest scent that always makes me feel at peace. I double-checked my pack, making sure I had everything: water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map, even though I wasn't planning on getting lost, and my phone. Not that I'd have any signal out here, but it felt good to have it just in case. I wasn't worried about wild animals or anything like that. Sure, there could be bears or mountain lions, but I knew the risks. I've hiked alone before, and it always felt safe to me, as long as I was cautious and aware of my surroundings. The first mile or so was easy. The trail was wide, the path clearly marked. I could hear birds chirping high above, and the sound of the wind moving through the trees created a kind of rhythmic background noise. My boots made a satisfying crunch with each step, and I fell into a comfortable pace. The kind of pace where your mind wanders, but in a good way, like a quiet hum in the back of your head. But then the trail began to narrow. It wasn't drastic at first, just a slight tightening, where the trees grew closer together and the path became more uneven. I noticed that the ground here was softer, more like a spongy moss than the usual dirt and gravel. The trees also started to look older, their trunks thicker, gnarled, with long, twisting roots that snaked out of the earth like something alive. The light filtering through the canopy grew dimmer, the shadows longer. There was something about the way the trees closed in around me that made the air feel heavier, colder even, despite the warmth of the day. The trail, which had been easy to follow, now began to fade in places. It wasn't as clear anymore, and there were sections where the ground had been overgrown with ferns and brambles. At first, I thought nothing of it. After all, it was a lesser-known trail, and nature had a way of reclaiming spaces like this. But as I kept moving forward, the feeling of being alone started to shift. It wasn't fear at first, not exactly, but a growing awareness that I was truly deep in the woods now, far from the road, and even farther from anyone who might be nearby. The air felt thicker somehow, like it was pressing in on me, and the sounds around me, birds, wind, the occasional rustling in the bushes, felt muffled, distant. I brushed off the feeling as just a trick of the mind, but it lingered, making me pick up my pace a little. The further I went, the more the path seemed to disappear altogether. At one point, I found myself stepping over a series of large fallen logs, their bark rotting away, giving off the faintest scent of decay. The trail had become a vague suggestion, not a clear path anymore. I paused for a moment, scanning the area. To the left, a steep incline led up to a rocky outcrop. To the right, the trees grew so thick it was hard to see through them. The sound of water flowing somewhere in the distance reached my ears, and I decided to follow it. As I moved toward the sound, the trail became less and less distinct. Now, it was more of a vague suggestion of a trail, a faint clearing that seemed to shift with every step I took. It wasn't like I was lost, at least not yet, but something about the way the woods seemed to close in around me made me second-guess every turn. I felt a small pang of unease in my gut, but I pushed it down. I didn't want to be one of those people who panicked at the first sign of something unfamiliar. The sound of water grew louder as I moved deeper, the trees thinning a little as I came upon a small creek. The water was clear and cool-looking, running over smooth rocks. I crouched down to take a drink, and as I did, I noticed something strange. There was a set of footprints leading to the water, but they weren't mine. They were larger, heavier prints, like someone had been here recently. The shape of the prints was odd, too, kind of jagged, like they didn't quite match a normal human footprint. My heart skipped a beat. Still, I didn't panic. I told myself it was probably just a hiker, maybe someone who had passed through earlier. I couldn't remember seeing any other cars at the trailhead, but maybe I'd missed one. It wasn't that unusual, right? I stood up and looked around, the woods still stretching out in every direction. There was no sign of anyone else. No sounds of voices, no movement, just the rushing water and the rustling leaves. I turned away from the creek, continuing down the path, but something felt different now. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I wasn't alone in these woods. but I couldn't figure out why the realization was unsettling. I kept walking, faster now, pushing my legs harder to keep moving. The path was almost gone now, just a loose collection of rocks, roots, and fallen branches. The woods felt more like a maze, the trees closing in tighter with each step. The light was fading too, the sun sinking lower behind the thick clouds. It was hard to tell what time it was anymore, but the change in the quality of light made me uneasy. The woods weren't getting darker, they were getting colder. A chill crept up my spine, and I felt my breath coming out in visible puffs as I moved faster. That's when I heard it. At first, it was so faint I thought I was imagining it. A soft rustling in the underbrush, something moving nearby. I froze, listening. The sound stopped, and for a few seconds, everything was still. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a small mammal. But then it came again, louder this time. A branch snapped in the distance, followed by a soft crunch of leaves. I told myself to calm down, but my heartbeat was thumping loudly in my chest now, like a drum. I scanned the area, every shadow and every movement sending my pulse into overdrive. My mind raced with possibilities. Someone else was out here, someone who didn't want to be found. I started moving again, but at a brisk pace now. I wanted to get back to the trailhead, to the safety of my car. But as I looked around, I realized the landscape had changed. The trees were closer together, and the path had nearly disappeared completely. That's when I heard it again, clearer now, a low, almost inaudible grunt coming from behind me. It was a typical Saturday morning when I decided to take a solo hike into the woods. The kind of morning that felt just right for something like this. Not too hot, not too cold. The air had that crispness to it that made the trees smell fresh, and the sun was just starting to break through the canopy of branches, casting dappled light on the forest floor. I packed up my bag the night before, water, some snacks, a map, a first aid kit, and my phone in case I needed it. Though I was planning to stay off the grid, I knew better than to rely solely on my sense of direction. I had been on solo hikes before, and I loved the peace that came with being out there. Just me, the woods, and the trail. This time, I decided to take a route I hadn't hiked before, one that was a bit more secluded and less traveled. It was called Pine Ridge, a 12-mile trail that wound through dense forest and opened up to breathtaking views of the valley below. The trailhead was located a few miles up a dirt road, and I knew from reading the reviews that it would be quiet. That was exactly what I wanted. The hike started off easy enough, the kind of trail where the ground was smooth, the trees thick, and the sunlight filtered through the leaves in a way that made everything look surreal. Birds chirped above, and the occasional squirrel darted across the trail, but otherwise, I was alone. The peace of it was like a balm. I couldn't help but feel completely at ease, walking through the secluded forest that seemed to go on forever. There was something comforting about knowing I was far enough away from civilization that no one would find me unless I called for help. The first couple of miles went by without incident. The path was well marked, and there were no real obstacles. The quiet hum of nature surrounded me, a constant and calming presence. I passed a small creek that cut through the trail. The sound of running water was refreshing, almost like it was washing away any lingering stress from the work week. I paused for a moment, listening to the water, just taking in the serenity before continuing on. As I moved deeper into the forest, the trail became more rugged. The dirt path started to give way to rocks and uneven terrain. The trees grew thicker, the shadows deeper, and the air seemed to grow cooler. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and I found myself having to pay more attention to where I was stepping. After about 4 hours of hiking, I stopped to take a break on a large rock that overlooked the valley. The view was incredible, with rolling hills stretching out far below me. I sat there for a while, catching my breath and taking in the scenery, thinking how lucky I was to have the whole place to myself. But then, just as I was about to finish my snack, I noticed something strange. There was a faint sound, almost like a twig snapping, but it was too far off to be an animal. I paused, listening intently, but there was nothing more. I shrugged it off as the wind or maybe an animal I couldn't see. Nature had its ways of making sounds, after all. Still, a slight unease settled in the pit of my stomach. It was probably nothing, I told myself, but I stood up, packed away my things, and continued down the trail. By now, the sun had started to dip below the horizon, and the woods seemed to grow darker. The air had a chill to it now, a coolness that crept into my bones, even through the layers I had on. I walked a few more miles, the path now barely visible in the growing darkness. The forest was dense, and every step seemed to make the trees loom closer. The noises of the forest, birds, animals, the wind, had quieted, and it was as if the whole place had gone silent, watching. My footsteps felt louder in the stillness, and every rustle of the leaves seemed amplified. I began to feel that uneasy sensation again, like someone was watching me, but every time I turned around, I saw nothing. That's when I started to feel a little off. There was no reason for it. The trail was straightforward, the path still marked with the occasional signpost. But the longer I walked, the more it felt like something was wrong. The air had changed somehow, becoming thicker, like I was walking through an invisible fog. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was no one there. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was just my imagination, that the fatigue was getting to me. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. My heart began to race. I glanced at my phone, but the signal was weak, just like it had been for the past few miles. I had no idea how far along I was or how much further I had to go. I had no choice but to keep walking. At one point, I stumbled over a rock and fell to my knees. As I pushed myself up, I noticed something strange, a set of footprints. They weren't too deep, but they were fresh, and they weren't there before. I bent down to inspect them more closely. They were larger than mine, booted, and looked like they had been made by someone wearing a heavy hiking boot. The prints seemed to disappear into the underbrush, leading off the trail and deeper into the woods. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It could have been anyone, another hiker, maybe someone who had taken the same trail earlier that day. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I turned around, scanning the trees, but the forest was still empty. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just beyond the tree line, watching me. I debated turning back, but I had come this far, and I was determined to finish the hike. I had to push through. So I kept going, my mind racing, the path now feeling increasingly unfamiliar. The woods had changed. The once clear trail was now tangled with roots and overgrown branches. It felt like I was walking deeper and deeper into something I didn't understand. Another mile passed, maybe more, and I began to feel truly isolated. The noise of the world was gone. There were no animals, no birds, nothing. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the forest floor, and even that seemed strangely muted. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw something up ahead, a cabin. It was old, weathered, and barely standing. A lone structure, far from any road, tucked into the trees. I hesitated for a moment, standing there, unsure whether to approach or turn back. But the cabin seemed like a place to rest, a place to gather myself before finishing the hike. So I made my way toward it. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the place was dark, dusty, and abandoned. There were no signs of recent activity, but the floorboards groaned under my weight, and the smell of mildew hung in the air. It felt like I was intruding on something that had been forgotten for a long time. I took a deep breath and set my pack down, deciding to rest for a few minutes before heading out again. But just as I was about to sit, I heard it, a sound from outside, a twig snapping, soft but distinct. I froze, listening. My heart pounded in my chest. I quickly peeked through the cracked window. Nothing. The forest outside was still, just as it had been. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I stayed in the cabin for what felt like an eternity, too afraid to leave but also too scared to stay. Eventually, I mustered the courage to leave. I grabbed my pack, stepped outside, and felt the cold air bite at my skin. The path ahead looked darker than before, the trees looming closer, almost suffocating. The last few miles were a blur. My legs were sore, and my mind was racing, but somehow, I made it back to the trailhead, my car parked just beyond the entrance. The moment I stepped out of the woods, I felt a weight lift off my chest. The eerie quiet was gone, replaced by the normal sounds of the outside world. I didn't look back as I drove away. The hike was over, but something about it lingered with me, the unease that I couldn't shake. I didn't know if it was the cabin, the footprints, or the strange feeling of being watched. But in the end, I was safe. The trail had ended, and I had made it out, and that was enough. The morning had started like any other. The sky was overcast, the kind of day where the clouds hovered low and heavy, casting a soft, muted light over everything. I had woken up early, as I often did before a hike, eager to get out there before the trail got too busy. I gathered my gear, a sturdy backpack, some water, snacks, my compass, and a map. It wasn't a particularly challenging hike, just a long one, about 10 miles through some forested terrain, ending at a small lake. I'd read a lot about this place, and the reviews had promised beautiful views and quiet surroundings. The air was cool, the kind of cool that nips at your skin but doesn't quite sting. It wasn't cold enough for a jacket, but I brought one along just in case. The trees stood tall and quiet, their branches gently swaying with the breeze. I liked that. There's something calming about nature, something that feels grounding. The soft crunch of gravel beneath my boots, the scent of pine, and the occasional rustling of wildlife in the underbrush made everything feel real, pure, unfiltered reality. I had planned to be on the trail for most of the day, so I made sure I was prepared. By the time I reached the trailhead, there were only a few cars in the lot. Most of the hikers would be starting their journey later in the morning, I figured. I adjusted the straps on my backpack, checked the map once more, and set off. The first few miles were easy, winding gently through the forest. The path was well maintained, with clear markers showing me where to go. The sound of birds chirping overhead was constant, but there was an eerie quiet in the air, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. But I didn't think too much of it. It was just a feeling, not something I could point to. As I walked deeper into the woods, the landscape began to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks thicker, and the undergrowth became more tangled. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves as something moved off in the distance, though I couldn't see what it was. The further I went, the quieter the trail became. The birds, once so vocal, seemed to have disappeared. I paused for a moment, looking around. The air was still, but something felt off. It wasn't that anything had changed, but the sense of being alone began to settle in. It wasn't uncomfortable, just odd. I pressed on, trying to shake the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The trail took a slight turn, and I descended into a small valley. There was a stream running through the valley, its water clear and sparkling as it meandered over the rocks. I paused to take a sip from my water bottle, watching the water flow. The sound was peaceful, calming. It helped settle my nerves, or at least I thought it did. The sun had started to peek through the clouds, casting dappled light across the trail. I could feel my body warming up as I walked, the steady rhythm of my footsteps keeping my mind from wandering too far. A couple of miles later, the path began to climb. The elevation gain wasn't too steep, but it was steady. I had been walking for nearly 3 hours at this point, and my legs were starting to feel the burn. Just when I thought I might take a break, I heard something ahead. At first, I thought it was just a squirrel or a bird, but then I noticed the soft sound of something moving through the underbrush, the subtle crackling of leaves beneath feet. I paused again, listening. The sound was too deliberate to be an animal, too heavy. I strained my eyes, scanning the trees ahead, but saw nothing. I stood still for a moment, unsure whether I should keep going or wait. The silence that followed felt heavier, more oppressive. I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe a hiker who had taken a detour off the main trail. After all, the area was known for being fairly remote, and it wasn't unusual for hikers to get off track. I decided to continue. With every step, the sound seemed to follow me, as if someone was walking just out of sight, pacing me. It was subtle at first, but it became more pronounced as I continued up the trail. It felt like something or someone was deliberately keeping their distance, but not letting me forget they were there. The feeling of being watched crept up my spine, but I forced myself to ignore it. I had been hiking for a long time, and I was used to being alone on the trails. There was no reason to panic. Another mile passed, and I began to see signs that I was nearing the lake. The trees started to thin out, and the trail opened up to a small clearing. I could see the shimmering surface of the lake in the distance, framed by the jagged edges of surrounding cliffs. It looked peaceful, untouched, exactly as I had imagined. But then the sound came again. This time it was unmistakable. A crunch of leaves underfoot, louder and closer than before. I froze, my heart beating faster. My hand instinctively reached for my phone, but it wasn't there. I had left it in the pack, buried beneath the layers of gear. I turned slowly, scanning the edge of the trees for any sign of movement. Nothing. I started to walk again, this time at a quicker pace. My footsteps hurried and uneven. I was nearly at the edge of the lake now, and the sound had stopped. But the feeling, the sensation of being watched, was still there. I could feel it on the back of my neck, a cold shiver that wouldn't go away. I glanced over my shoulder one last time before I reached the water's edge. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. The lake stretched out before me, calm and still. I sat down at the water's edge, dipping my feet into the cool water. The soothing motion of the lake was enough to settle my nerves, and for a while, I was able to relax. The silence that had followed me from the forest was now a welcome relief. I rested there for a while, drinking in the serenity of the lake, the mountains rising behind it like silent sentinels. The sky was clearing now, and I could feel the warmth of the sun beginning to take hold. It had been a long day already, and the promise of peace was all I needed. Eventually, I stood up, stretching my legs. I glanced at the time on my watch and realized I'd been sitting there longer than I intended. I needed to start heading back before it got too late. The hike out would take another few hours, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't caught in the woods after dark. As I turned to leave, I heard it again. The sound of something moving in the woods, just beyond the trees. This time it was closer, much closer. My heart skipped a beat, and my pulse quickened. I didn't want to look. I knew that if I turned around, if I acknowledged what was happening, it would only make it worse. So I didn't look. I started walking, my pace quickening as the sound of footsteps, deliberate, heavy footsteps, followed behind me. The trail back felt longer, darker. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. I wasn't just hearing things now. I wasn't imagining it. I was being followed. By the time I reached the point where the trail curved, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest was no longer quiet. The branches swayed as though in response to something unseen, the air thick with the scent of earth and pine. I turned the corner, still walking faster now, trying to ignore the panic rising in my chest. I needed to make it back to the trailhead. I needed to be away from this place. But when I reached the clearing, the place where the path split, where I had first felt the unease, I finally saw what I had been dreading. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of someone watching me. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, their figure barely visible in the fading light. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I didn't care about the route back or the path I had taken. I just ran, my legs pumping beneath me, the sound of my breath loud in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot, where the faint glow of a few cars offered some semblance of safety. By the time I got to my car, I didn't even look back. I didn't need to. The feeling that had followed me through the forest, the pressure of being watched, it was gone. I was out of the woods, and whatever had been there was left behind. I started the engine, my hands still trembling, and drove away without a second glance. I didn't know who or what it had been, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But I did know this. I would never hike alone in those woods again. I had always enjoyed hiking, the thrill of the wilderness, the feeling of being disconnected from the world, and the peace it brought me were what drew me in. I didn't care much for the busy, crowded cities or the noise of modern life. There was something calming about being in nature, surrounded by nothing but trees, rocks, and the endless sky above. I had been planning this hike for months. It was a route I had done before, but this time I was going to take a different trail, one that veered off the beaten path. It wasn't a well-known trail, so I was sure to have some solitude. At least that's what I thought when I first started out. The day was clear, a perfect spring day. The sun was high, but there was a cool breeze that kept the air fresh. I packed my usual gear, a small backpack with some snacks, water, a first aid kit, and a light jacket in case the weather changed. I also brought my trusty map, although I had hiked this area so many times that I felt I didn't really need it. I parked my car at the edge of the trailhead, a small parking lot surrounded by trees. There were only a few cars, which meant the trail was going to be quiet. Good. I liked the idea of not seeing anyone for hours. The trail started off easy enough, a wide, well-maintained path that wound through a dense forest of pine and oak. The trees provided welcome shade, and the scent of fresh pine needles filled the air. Birds chirped above, and the occasional rustle of leaves told me that some animal was moving about, probably squirrels or rabbits. I couldn't help but smile. It was just like every other hike I had done, peaceful, serene, and utterly disconnected from the chaos of everyday life. After an hour or so, I reached the point where the trail split. To my left was the main trail, which looped around a lake, a popular spot for tourists. To the right was the lesser-known path I had chosen, a narrow trail that seemed to disappear into the woods. The signs were old, weathered, and somewhat faded, but they pointed me in the right direction. I took the right turn and immediately noticed how the trail seemed to narrow. The trees grew denser and the underbrush thicker. The path was less traveled, the ground rougher, and the air had a heavier, more earthy smell to it. I enjoyed it, though, felt like I was truly getting away from everything. The sounds of birds and small animals seemed more pronounced here, and I could hear the occasional creak of a branch moving in the wind. As I hiked deeper into the forest, the quiet was almost unnerving. There was no distant hum of traffic, no voices of people talking or laughing, just the wind in the trees and the occasional sound of a twig snapping underfoot. I found it strange that I hadn't seen any other hikers, but then again, it was a less popular trail, and most people preferred the main route. The trail wound its way uphill, and the terrain began to change. The forest thinned out, giving way to large boulders and jagged rocks. It was steep in places, and I had to be careful with my footing as I navigated the uneven ground. Sweat started to bead on my forehead, but I didn't mind. The exertion felt good. I paused for a moment at the top of the hill to catch my breath and take in the view. The trees had thinned, and I could see far into the distance, down into the valley below. The landscape was a patchwork of greens and browns, and the air felt cooler up here. I stood there for a while, enjoying the silence and the beauty of it all. But as I continued, things began to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first. It was just a sense that something was wrong. I couldn't hear the usual forest sounds as much anymore. The birds had stopped singing, and even the rustling of leaves seemed muffled. It felt as though the forest had become unnaturally still. I kept walking, hoping it was just my imagination. The trail started to narrow even more, and soon I was walking along a thin ledge with a steep drop on one side. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease as I carefully navigated the rocks. My boots scraped against the rough stone, and the loose gravel underfoot made it hard to keep my balance. But I pushed the feeling away and focused on the path ahead. The trees became denser again, their branches stretching overhead like twisted fingers. The sky above was barely visible through the thick canopy, and the light seemed to dim. The air had grown noticeably cooler as well, and the breeze had picked up, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and wet moss. I continued on, telling myself it was just my nerves getting the best of me. After all, I had hiked alone plenty of times before. I wasn't one to scare easily, but the deeper I went, the more the uneasy feeling gnawed at me. Suddenly, I heard something. A rustling in the underbrush, followed by a sharp snap of a twig. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was likely just an animal, but the sound felt off, too deliberate, too loud. I took a deep breath and slowly looked around, my eyes scanning the trees and the ground below me. Nothing, just the thick forest, as quiet and still as ever. Still, the feeling didn't leave me. It was as if I was being watched, as if someone or something was moving through the trees just out of sight. I kept walking, my steps quicker now. The trail was beginning to get rougher, with roots sticking up from the ground and large rocks that made it hard to maintain a steady pace. But my unease was growing stronger with each step. I could almost hear my own breath, the quickening of my heartbeat, the thud of my boots against the earth. Everything felt so quiet, so tense, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I finally reached a small clearing, a patch of soft grass surrounded by thick trees. It seemed like a good place to stop for a break. I took off my backpack, pulled out a water bottle, and sat down on a rock, trying to calm myself. The air was still, the silence overwhelming. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, staring out into the trees, but eventually, I felt a slight shift in the air. It wasn't much, just a subtle change, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stood up quickly, my instincts telling me that something was wrong. Something was very wrong. I had been hiking for hours now, and I had not seen a single person. The forest felt too empty, too quiet. I glanced around, trying to reassure myself, but the anxiety in my chest only tightened. The trees around me felt too close, too oppressive. I grabbed my map from my backpack and checked it, but everything seemed fine. The trail was supposed to loop back around and lead me to a small campsite about 5 miles ahead. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was just being paranoid. But then I heard it again, a rustling noise coming from behind me, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large stepping through the brush. I turned around sharply, but there was nothing, just the dense thicket of trees. I felt a surge of panic. Maybe it was an animal, but it didn't feel right. The sound wasn't like the usual movements of wildlife. This was too controlled, too deliberate. I quickly packed my things, my hands shaking slightly as I zipped up my backpack. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, like the forest itself was closing in on me. I started to move quickly again, my pace faster than before. The trail was no longer a path. It had become a maze of rocks, roots, and dense undergrowth. I could feel my breath coming in shallow gasps, my mind racing. The rustling had stopped, but the feeling of being followed remained. Every crack of a twig, every snap of a branch made my heart skip a beat. It was then that I realized I had lost my way. The trail had become unclear, the markers had faded, and I had wandered too far off the path. Panic set in. My mind raced, and I tried to force myself to stay calm, but the forest felt like it was closing in, pressing against me from all sides. There was no sound now, no movement, just the eerie quiet, and I felt completely alone. I stopped in my tracks, trying to get my bearings. I knew I had to get out of here. I couldn't stay on this trail much longer. I pulled out my map again, but the ink was smudged from the sweat on my palms. The lines and markings blurred together. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and decided to retrace my steps. I knew I had to be careful. The terrain was difficult, and I couldn't afford to get lost even more than I already was. For what felt like hours, I pushed through the thick brush and jagged rocks. The feeling of being watched never left, and I could sense something just behind me, though when I turned, nothing was ever there. My legs were aching, and my breath was ragged, but I couldn't stop. Not now. And then, finally, I saw it, the faint outline of the main trail in the distance. Relief flooded through me, and I stumbled toward it, moving faster now. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. When I reached the main trail, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I had made it out, but I knew one thing for certain. I would never take that side trail again. The parking lot was still empty when I reached my car, but it didn't matter. I was safe. I drove away, my heart still pounding, but I felt the tension slowly drain from my body. I couldn't explain what had happened on that trail.